Hello, how's everybody doing? Hopefully you can hear me all right. Uh, all right, good. Pete, how you doing? Hopefully everything's going all right out there in Schenectady. All right, here we go. So tonight we're going to be talking about what are we going to be talking about? Something. There we go. Uh, we talked about the departure, the clearances, the en route, looking at the en route chart. Today we're going to talk a little bit about arrival and introduction to the instrument approach procedures. If you, as we go along, if you have any questions, you can just pop them up on the chat and I'll go through them. I'll leave this up for a little while, so if you guys want to review anything after the fact, I'll be up there for a little bit. So, getting started. Uh, mm, so similar to departure procedures, arrival procedures are used as a method of transitioning you from the en route structure to the approach structure into the airport, uh, especially in use at your larger, busier airports. Uh, where the departure procedure gave everybody an initial set of instructions and then a specific instructions depending on what you were planning on doing after that. These start off from course specific instructions, a transition point, and they get to a fix that the star is using a name for. So you can see on this one here is the Keaton 6 arrival, and where does it begin? At Keaton intersection, and that's where the thick black line starts. So you have your transition instructions followed by specific arrival instructions starting at the thick black line. Uh, well, that was weird. Okay, sorry about that. uh, the way you would file this is similar to filing a departure procedure. You put the transition point that you plan on using, followed by the arrival procedure. So the different transition points that they have on this arrival procedure here, the Keaton 6, would be uh, Tiverton VOR, so TVT, CTW, or Briggs intersection, or VOR there. So it would be the VOR name followed by the arrival procedure. Again, just like the departure procedure, you can put in there that you don't want to no SID, no star in the remarks section of flight plan, which just means that if they want to give you one now, they're just going to have to spell it out to you point by point. But that goes back to the day where these were in a different publication. They joined them into the regular publication that was sent out with, mixed them in with the instrument approach procedures. And now, certainly if you have an electronic flight book, you're going to have the arrival procedures available. So there's really no reason to put on there no SID, no star anymore. The information is available to us, and we should expect to use them as necessary or as assigned. Okay, so an instrument approach procedure. They're there to get us aligned on the final approach course for the airport. Uh, you have, and they're also there to provide obstruction clearance. Uh, Different kinds, they're broken down into different phases there, or different kinds of approaches, classes. We have precision approaches, uh, which are your ILS approach is the one that we're most commonly going to deal with. PAR is available at some military airports, but not readily available at most places. And the GPS landing system, or GLS, that's a next-gen system that has not trickled down yet to general aviation. So for our purposes, the ILS approach is pretty much the only precision approach that we're going to have to deal with. Then you also have the approaches with vertical guidance, which include your uh, GPS approaches, uh, also your LDA or localizer type directional aid. We're going to be going over these specifically as we go along. And your LPV approach, which has, it's the LPV approach is your GPS version of the ILS, but it's still considered a non-precision approach. Uh, that being said, on your check ride, you have to demonstrate one precision approach and two non-precision approaches. If for some reason any local ILSs are out of service, you can substitute an LPV approach for your check ride. Uh, Beyond that, it's still considered a non-precision approach. Then you have your non-precision approaches specifically. You got your VOR, localizer, NDB, which are pretty much mostly gone by now, but GPS, SDF, and ASR, those are all the different ones. And then you also have charted visual approaches. So those are instrument approaches. You have to do them in visual conditions, but they have charts, and you have to follow the procedures just like any other instrument approach. Typical instrument approaches are broken down into different segments. You have the initial approach segment, which starts at the initial approach fix, and from the initial approach segment, you have the intermediate segment, and the job of the intermediate segment is to get you turned around and on to the final approach segment. From the final approach segment, you have that is going to take you down to the missed approach point, and then from there, it's going to take you to the missed approach procedure and hold. When you're cleared for an approach, the approach gives you clearance to the missed approach hold. So you're cleared for the entire approach, including the missed approach, whenever you're cleared for an instrument approach. Different types of, when we're looking at an approach chart, we want to find an initial approach fix. They're going to be labeled IAF. Many charts have multiple of them, like the one that is shown there, the RNAV 28. There's 3 initial approach fixes shown there for the different GPS approaches, and you would just pick the one that you want to use that was most convenient for the direction you're coming in from. You can see Walco there, the middle one is labeled an IF as well, so that's just an intermediate fix. So you have, if you're using Jorax, here's your initial approach fix, Walco becomes an intermediate fix. On your GPS approaches, you're going to have a final approach waypoint. This is true if they overlay, if they have a GPS overlay on top of an older approach like a VOR approach, they're going to add a final approach waypoint if there isn't one already. The final approach fix takes you down to the missed approach point. And then, if you're doing a non-precision or one without a glide slope, that's going to take you to the missed approach waypoint, which is labeled here on the chart. Right there. So you'll notice that it's got a waypoint symbol with a circle around it. So anything that has a circle around that means that's a flyover waypoint, meaning that you have to cross over it. These are called flyby waypoints here, that style. And with that style, you can use, your GPS can use its turn anticipation to kind of help you cut the corners so you don't have to don't fly directly over top of them. But your missed approach waypoint is always a flyover waypoint. So that's for your non-precision approaches. For your precision approaches or your ones with a glide slope, you're going to have a decision height. That's found on your ILS approach because it's referencing a height above the ground. Listed in, we reference it using mean sea level, but your decision height. If it's a GPS approach, because you're talking about satellites, is called a decision altitude. But beyond that, they're pretty synonymous. That's the height at which you make a decision. And then that takes you to the missed approach segment, where you have your missed approach point or decision height, and that takes you all the way to the missed approach hold, which is shown in this approach over there. Oop. So the procedure turn is used to get you turned around again and on the final approach course. Sometimes you'll see the letters or the word no PT, which means that no procedure turn is authorized. And when you're getting radar vectors to the final approach course, you're not going to be doing a procedure turn. They're going to get you a heading to intercept your final approach course. Or if you're conducting timed approaches to a holding fix, they should not include a procedure turn. Altitudes described during the procedure turn is the minimum altitude. You can enter the procedure, at or above that altitude. You just can't go below it until you hit the next step down. Different types of procedure turns are a little flexible. Most of them want you to stay within 10 miles while you're getting turned around. This could be especially important if there's strong winds that you're having a battle, to make sure that you don't get don't go too far away, and make sure you leave yourself a little extra room if you know you're going to have a tailwind on the way back. But most of them want you staying within about 10 miles. A lot of times, especially when a holding pattern is used as an initial approach fix, we usually just use the holding entry technique as our method of getting turned around, and we're not expected to do any specific turns around the holding pattern. If we want to, though, to get better established, we have to ask to. You have to request that. And have a clearance to do the procedure turn. If you hear the words cleared straight in for any approach, then you're not supposed to do the procedure turn. If they clear you and they use the word straight in, no procedure turn is going to be done. And the maximum speed during procedure turn, it tells us, is 200 knots. Different types of procedure turns that you'll encounter. One is called the 45-degree procedure turn barb. Uh, so they tell you the headings that you're going to use to fly this, but however you arrive at the initial approach fix here, you would, once you cross the vortex, you would want to get established on the outbound course, which is labeled down here. So you'd want to turn time tune and get established on the 223 radial outbound. We're not going to parallel it. We actually want to get onto it. Now, this type of procedure turn here is, this type of approach is depicted on the image here is what we call a on-airport approach, which means that there are no intermediate fixes and the VOR is right on top of the airport. So if that's the case, when you go outbound, you want to give yourself a little bit of time, usually at least about 2 minutes, maybe 3, depending on the winds. Because once you get turned around, you're going to have to, leave yourself room to lose the altitude you need to get down to the minimum descent altitude, and still leave you time to see and land at the airport. But anyway, you get established on the outbound procedure or on the outbound radial, fly out about 2 minutes, and then again it just shows the headings that you're going to use are listed right on the procedure turn. So after you've gone outbound about 2 minutes, you're going to make a left-hand turn to 178 degrees, and here you're going to fly out for about 1 minute. And when you make your turn back inbound, the turn is always going to be away from the airport. And so you would make a right-hand turn here to 358. And as you make that turn to 358, you want to make sure you tune in the final approach course onto your VOR, because that's where you're going to be looking to intercept that inbound. And so you would fly inbound and intercept that 043. You have to be within 3/4 scale deflection to be considered on the instrument approach, and that's important, especially for any altitudes. If we want to lose any altitudes, you have to be established within 3/4 scale deflection before you can start any further descents down on your approach there. Now this approach here has an outer marker, which if you have the capability, that's kind of nice because you can use that as a reference point for timing. So using that outer marker, I would fly to the outer marker and then I would go outbound a minute, start my procedure turn, and then come back inbound. The holding pattern reversal, again, just used to get yourself turned around and onto the final approach course. So key things to watch out for are these notes. So this one's telling us no PT or no procedure turn is authorized for arrival on the radials 100 clockwise to 204. So if we're coming from somewhere around there, 100 degrees clockwise to about 204, and we were coming inbound to the fix from there, we would expect to just cross the initial approach fix here and then just continue outbound on the 323. Again, we could elect to do a turn in the hold if we think we're going to need it to lose altitude or get the plane better established and ready for the approach, but you have to request that from air traffic control and have to be cleared to do it prior to doing any turns in the holding pattern. If you're coming from any other direction outside of that arc, you're expected to do the recommended holding entry to get yourself established back inbound. So if you're coming from this side over here, you're coming from the fix end, non-protected side or unprotected side, so that's going to call for a teardrop entry. So we would cross this fix and then referencing our radial down here, we would establish ourselves in about a 30-degree intercept angle. So I go outbound on a 113 heading for about a minute, and then I'd make a a right-hand turn to get established and join the 323 inbound. Coming from over on this side, we're coming from the fixed and protected side. So protected is P for parallel. So we're going to want to use our parallel entry. So we would cross the fix, parallel the outbound, turn to 143, go out about a minute, and then make a left-hand turn to establish ourselves in about a 30-degree intercept angle to join the 323 inbound. And then once we are established inbound, we would just continue through onto the next segment of the approach. This is a teardrop course reversal. A lot of these have seen disappeared over the years. They're being used less and less. On this one, for wherever we arrive from, we would cross the fix and get ourselves established on the 223 outbound. Now, depending on the winds, I brought this one up because you can see that you're actually starting on one side of the ILS localizer and having to cross over that. So if I was doing this approach, I would wait to start my outbound timing. So on my, I want to have my navigation receivers set up probably with the VOR on my secondary nav and the ILS approach set in on the primary nav. And as I start outbound using the secondary nav, I would turn time tune to 323 and wait till I cross through that localizer to begin my timing. And from there, again, you time out for about a minute or so, and then you're going to make a right-hand turn to come around and establish yourself on the localizer course inbound on the 062 inbound. I found, just based on experience, I was, Elmira used, in fact, this is the one from Elmira. I don't know if they still have it or not, but if we started the timing there, we almost always cross through the localizer if, on our way back inbound. So just got to give yourself enough room. Sometimes you got to look at the approach chart and do a little strategizing there to make sure you give yourself enough room to get things done. Okay, the approach clearance once you're cleared for the approach, you're expected to do the approach even if you're in visual conditions, unless you do something different. So the something different would be additionally cleared for a visual approach, or the contact approach, which you're going to talk about shortly, or you cancel IFR. But once you've been cleared for an approach, even if you encounter visual conditions, until you receive additional clearance or cancel your IFR flight plan, you're expected to conduct that approach. You can always choose to go missed at any time during the approach if you're not established. You just have to make sure you advise ATC right away that you are going missed so that you can get further instructions from them. If the airport has only one instrument approach, add it. You may just hear cleared for the approach where they don't name the approach specifically. Or if they have multiple approaches, like if you're coming into our airport, which has 2 GPS approaches, and they just say cleared for the approach, uh, then you can just pick whichever approach you want and however you want to do it and just go do it. Pretty rare that they would give you that instruction, but uh, that's what it means if they just say cleared for the approach. Otherwise, they're going to clear you for a specific approach. So cleared for the GPS 10, the RNAV 10. They use GPS and RNAV synonymously. You'll hear both of them. I think they favor RNAV, as GPS is a part of the RNAV system. The approach clearance can be kind of long, and sometimes because of the length of the clearance, it can be difficult to remember the elements that you want to make sure that you read back to them. But it does follow a fairly standard format. The first thing they're going to do is tell you where you are relative to the final approach fix or other reference, so that you have a little positional awareness. They're going to give you a heading to fly as necessary to intercept an approach, an altitude, and a clearance. If they leave out a heading, then you would just use your last assigned heading or navigation instruction. And the 3 elements that you want to make sure that you're ready to read back and make sure you listen up for are the HAC, your heading, altitude, and what you're cleared for. And those are the big 3 things that you want to make sure that you're ready to read back. One of the fun things, especially when you're getting vectors for like a ILS approach at Rochester or you know, most especially when you're doing practice approaches, the air traffic controllers have their own little cues for when they like to do things too, to remember to get things done. And a lot of times they'll issue you your approach clearance right as you're getting ready to intercept the glide slope and you have to start down and all that other stuff. So, you want to listen for the clearance, read back the clearance, and probably at least flip the radio to the tower frequency, the next frequency that you're getting handed off to. Once they clear you, or once they tell you to contact tower, they almost always tell you to contact tower right as you are getting ready to intercept the glide slope. Once you've received the IFR clearance, again, that's the clearance all the way to the missed approach point. It does not clear you to land, so you still have to receive landing clearance from tower. But anyway, if you're busy and you've been told to contact tower, it's good to switch over to the tower frequency. But just remember, aviate, navigate, communicate. Take care of the airplane, make sure you're navigating right, and then you can make your radio call to tower. Because you've already been cleared, you're not in any dire need to communicate with them. Good idea to monitor the frequency, though. When they give you the heading to fly, I like to use it even as I'm getting ready to read back the rest of the clearance. I like to start turning to that heading right away, especially doing practice approaches. You like to turn us in pretty close to the localizer. And if you wait too long to start the turn to the heading they've been giving you, a lot of times you'll end up overshooting the final approach course and then have to re-intercept it from the other side or receive a further heading clearance from air traffic control. So, some guidance that controllers have with regard to your assigned altitudes on any vector to final clearance. For your precision approach, you're not going to be above the glide slope or not above the glide slope intercept altitude. And non-precision approach, they're going to put you at an altitude that allow descent in accordance with the procedure. They can sometimes, have you down at a slightly lower altitude than may be published for the, prior to the final approach fix. But they're, you're always going to be at, no lower than the altitude prescribed for the final approach fix. They have area that they're trying to intercept and get you on the final approach course, and intercept angles, if you're more than 2 nautical miles away, which is most typical, they usually try to put us somewhere between 3 and 5 miles away from the glide slope intercept point or the final approach fix. So you can almost always expect a 30-degree intercept angle. If you're inside of 2 miles, then they can't give you any more than a 20-degree intercept angle. Knowing the standard intercept angle is handy, because if you know you're doing the ILS runway 28 approach, then you can kind of get ahead in your head, of the approach clearance and have an idea of what they're going to be telling you by knowing that your intercept angles, depending on whether you're north or south of the final approach course, is either going to be 250 if you're north of it, or typically a 310 if you're south of it. So that'll help you when you're listening for the final approach course, or kind of know what to expect to hear. And what is really useful for, though, too, is double checking the controller. Keep in mind, part of the readback process is not only for the air traffic control to confirm that you received the approach clearance, but also as a double check of the heading or clearance itself to make sure it makes sense for what you're trying to do. Everybody can make mistakes, and so you want to, with any clearance that you receive, or heading or altitude, it should always be, trust but verify. If they don't give any specific heading or altitude in the clearance, then you just maintain the last assigned until you join the final approach course. If they're giving you vectors for the final approach course and they pass you through the final approach course, don't do anything drastic. Just call them up and tell them that you've passed through the final approach course. Sometimes they do that intentionally for spacing, and on a rare occasion, sometimes they forget something. So in either case, if you find yourself passing through the final approach course that you're expecting to intercept, just advise that you're through the final approach course, and they'll give you additional vectors as necessary to get intercepted onto the final approach course there for you. All right, so if you're not getting radar vectors, then you're going to use an initial approach fix to get established on the instrument approach. And you would be using the last assigned route. So if you were cleared to a specific approach fix, then you would use the last assigned route, or sometimes they'll have what they call a feeder route, which is kind of like, well, they're thin black lines, but they usually reference a waypoint or a VOR or something that has a radial off of it that will take you to the initial approach fix. A lot of times they'll also reference an altitude on those. We'll look at those when we look at some of the instrument approaches here. You always have to maintain altitudes at or above any prescribed altitudes until you are established on the portion of the final approach course. Or, I'm sorry, a portion of the instrument approach. The instrument approach on the chart is referenced by the thick black line. So you have to be within 3/4 scale deflection on one of those route segments referenced by the thick black line before you can make any further descents down. And keep in mind, most of the times those altitudes are at or above. Dog is in there snoring behind me. All right. I put a half scale deflection here because that's really what you want to be shooting for. You should try to stay within half scale deflection. 3/4 scale deflection gets a little dicey trying to get back on course at that point. But technically, if you're within 3/4 scale deflection, then you're on the odd chance that you're using an NDB, you have to be within plus or minus 5 degrees of the inbound bearing. Cleared for straight in. Again, we don't use any approach procedures. If you're wanting to request a specific instrument approach, there's 3 basic elements to the approach request. It's what approach, at what airport, oops, and how do you want to do it? So I'd like to do the RNAV 28 approach at Williams & Solis via the JORAX initial approach fix. You can also say I'd like the vectors for the final approach course at for the RNAV 28 at Williams & Solis. But they always want to know what approach, what airport, and how you want to do it. Those are the 3 basic elements of an approach request. If you're doing practice approaches, then we can add to that how will this, things that they're going to ask you if you don't give them the information is how the approach will terminate. And that essentially refers to what do you plan on doing when you get to the missed approach point. Are you going to do a low approach, a full stop landing, touch and go? You'd like to do the published missed approach. They want to know what you plan on doing at the missed approach waypoint. And then beyond that, they want to know what you plan on doing next. So to really make them happy, going into, especially, your larger airports, doing practice approaches, you could say I'd like to request, vectors for the ILS runway 22 approach at Rochester. Be a low approach followed by the ILS runway 28 approach. If you only give them the first 3 parts, then they're going to ask you how will this approach terminate. And then if you say something that's not a full stop landing, they're going to ask you what you want to do next. So you can save them a couple radio calls by putting that information in with your request. Keep in mind, you're still going to have to probably repeat it back a couple times because a lot of times that information doesn't get past the tower. Tower asks you the same thing, and then you get back on with approach, and you got a different controller, and you're going to be telling them what you want to do again too. But I would say most often the information gets passed along and helps them out in the long run. If you're doing practice approaches, they're also going to give you some missed approach instructions. Now, if you're VFR, they're never going to give you a specific altitude to maintain, or very rarely. They may give you a at or above altitude. but they're not going to give you a specific altitude to maintain. So you're on your own to figure out what altitudes you want to use it during the different approach segments. Uh, the You kind of use your imagination of what altitudes you probably get, but also I like to look at. Sometimes I'll look at the sectional chart. So like in the area here by Rochester, you want to make sure that at no time are you giving usually I add about 500 to those numbers to make sure you're not getting too low at any point. So using that information plus the information on the instrument approach procedures will help ensure that you don't get too low while you're out doing practice approaches. So a typical missed approach instruction for a VFR training flight would be to, oftentimes they'll just give you a fly runway heading and maintain VFR for the altitude. If your IFR is going to be fly runway heading and then probably climb maintain 3,000, they're going to give you a specific altitude they want you to fly. Approach categories are determined by taking your stall speed and multiplying that by 1.3. So most of the airplanes that we fly are Category A aircraft. This is important for the identifying the approach minimums that are specific to your approach category. So again, most of us are flying Category A aircraft. If you're flying it at Category B speeds, however, if you're going to fly the approach above 91 knots, then you should use Category B minimums. You can see the different categories there for the larger, faster aircraft. So we use the approach category to determine our approach minimums. And one of the minimums that we'll get is what we call an MDA, or a minimum descent altitude. That's the lowest altitude that you can go to before a visual descent is made into the airport. And that's a at or above altitude. That's a, for the check ride purposes, that's a plus 100 minus 0 tolerance on a minimum descent altitude. So I usually like to initiate my level offs for MDA about 100 feet high, so that puts me about 50 feet high, and that'll give you a little bit of room to maneuver. Doing a non-precision approach and getting down to a minimum descent altitude, especially if you're doing it for real and weather that's, you may be in visual conditions, but still poor visibility. So your workload can be pretty high when you're trying to fly the airplane, navigate, and also look outside for the airport. So making sure that we stay at or above the MDA is imperative. Then we also have our decision height and decision altitude. So those are most easily described as the altitude at which you're expected to make a decision to continue the approach or not. So if your decision height is here, it's implied that you may go slightly below that altitude as necessary to transition back to a climb. But you hit your decision height, and if you see the airport, you continue. If not, you have to transition back to a climb. Straight in landing minimums will be indicated by the letter S in front there of the, down in the minimum section here of the instrument approach plate. And for it to be considered for there to have prescribed straight-in minimums, the final approach course has to be aligned within 30 degrees of the runway. Uh, Here we can see we have the different approach categories. You can see that for the a straight in for the ILS approach runway 4, all categories have the same approach minimums. And so this is your decision height. That's your height MSL, so that's what you'd be reading on your altimeter setting. And this is your required visibility, 1,800 feet, that's RVR. Uh, the number that we see next to it here is our height above the ground when we're at the decision height. So to do the ILS approach, you got to have a ceiling certainly no less than 200 feet, and you probably want it to be a little bit higher than that to have a chance to be able to see the airport environment. You can see a localizer approach, which is a non-precision approach, has higher approach minimums as far as, and so this is a MDA here, or minimum descent altitude, so that's an at or above. We got to have, 2,400 RVR, or roughly a half a mile visibility, and we are 5 feet above the ground, so that means that we probably need at least about a 600-foot ceiling to have a chance to get underneath the clouds and be able to see the airport as necessary to land. The stuff that's in the parentheses is for military pilots. When we, going back here, you can see if we're circling, so you could do potentially what we call a circling approach, where you do the ILS or localizer approach, but you plan on landing on a different runway. So you could do the approach for runway 4 with a circle to land runway 22. You could also circle to land any of the other runways that are there. Circle to land runway 22, 25, or 28, or 10 or 7. You just have to make sure you request that and have that as your clearance. But anytime you're doing a circling maneuver, the minimums are going to be higher. Again, these are at or above minimums. Visibility is going to be higher. And you'll notice that this looks like it's lower than that one, but that's because circling minimums reference the airport elevation, which is, this references the actual elevation at the final approach point. So we use the circling approach when straight-in minimums are not available or attainable. When the final approach course is outside of 30 degrees offset from the center line of the runway, they're going to have only circling minimums at that airport. If it doesn't allow for a reasonable descent, if you intend to land on another runway, maybe the primary runway is closed, so you could do the approach for one runway with the intent of landing on the other. Maybe the winds favor another runway. Like Ithaca, for example, just has their ILS approach is only for one runway, and so if you want to land on the other runway, you do the ILS and then circle to land the other runway. But you have to be cleared for it. So you can see the phraseology I list there. In the example, it says cleared for the ILS runway 28, circle 25. Circling minimums provide the obstacle clearance. And the way to remember what they are for the different categories, is to remember 357 and then 2, 3, 4, 5. So we got All right. They gotta fix that. That's so annoying. Duh, duh, duh. 1.3 miles, nautical miles of the airport environment. And the way they measure the circling radii is taking that distance from all of the uh, major reference points for the airport. So just measuring 1.3 all the way around there. Uh, Certainly the higher approach category, you can be farther away from the airport, but the approach minimums are typically going to be higher. If you are circling to land and maybe the approach minimums are like this one for 1060, if pattern altitude is 1400 feet and you find yourself clear of clouds at 1400 feet, you don't have to go all the way down to 1060. That's a at or above altitude. To make your circling maneuver go a little easier, more of what we're used to, you can stop if able at pattern altitude and just maintain pattern altitude until you're ready to make your approach to land. It says maneuver the shortest path to the base or downwind leg as appropriate. Uh, there's no restriction from passing over the airport or other runways. Uh, if you're going into a non-towered airport, you should try to keep, well, you should plan on keeping turns, left-hand turns as standard, or if there's any published right-hand patterns, you should use those as appropriate. Keep in mind that a lot of times, those non-standard traffic patterns are there for obstacle avoidance. Keep in mind that other aircraft may be out there as well. So, if it's VFR conditions and you're doing a circling maneuver, you should give way as necessary to other aircraft that may already be in the traffic pattern. If there's no weather at the airport, it might be a good idea to fly over at or above circling altitudes, get the wind information before you choose a runway that you want to land on. Uh, the As an example of some basic maneuvering techniques that you could use to get yourself established on the final approach course. You can, you can maneuver yourself right onto a base to final. You could fly a upwind leg and then do a downwind base and final approach. You can sidestep onto the downwind leg. You can fly over and enter the pattern as necessary for the runway that you want to land on. Now, if the last statement here, if you lose contact with the runway environment during the circling procedure, then you should immediately go into a climbing turn. So if you lost contact somewhere over here, you lose sight of the runway, climbing turn, always towards the runway environment, and then you get yourself reestablished on the final approach course and execute the published missed approach procedure. But always a climbing turn towards the airport environment, because that's we know there's no obstacles over the airport, so that's usually where you want to go. Oh, that's a lot of words. Okay. So what this one here is talking about is When are we allowed to go below decision height, decision altitude, or MDA? There's three basic criteria that have to be met before you can descend below your decision height or MDA. And that is one, that the aircraft has to be continuously in a position from which a descent using normal maneuvers and a normal rate of descent uh, into the airport environment. So if you see the runway late, you'd have to, pull in all the flaps, cut the power, chop, drop. That's not normal maneuvers. And so if you see the runway late and that's what you think you need to do, you should go misapproach and try the approach again. Flight visibility cannot be less than the prescribed visibility for the approach. And that's, as determined by the pilot. So if it says you have to have 1 mile visibility, you have to be able to say that you have 1 mile of forward visibility at all times during your descent from MDA or decision height down to the airport environment. And you have to have at least you have to have the airport environment in sight. And so that includes one of these things listed here. So any of the runway markings, the runway lighting, including approach lights. If the runway has an approach lighting system, typically associated with like an ILS approach, uh, if all you see is the approach lights, you can continue down a little bit farther until you're 100 feet above the touchdown zone. So, for example, a typical ILS, it has a 200-foot decision height. If you got down to your decision height and all you saw were the approach lights, but you didn't see the threshold or the runway end identifier lights or anything else, you can continue down an extra 100 feet. Hopefully by then you can see something else, one of these other things listed there. But you have to be able to see one of those things listed there to be able to continue the approach down to the runway. So 3 things: flight visibility, airport environment in sight, and be in a position to make a normal landing using normal maneuvers. Approaches on parallel runways. If they're going to be doing approaches at parallel runways, they're going to tell you about it. Depending on how close the runways are to, they either have to, if they're too close for a simultaneous approach path, you see here we got to have at least 4,300 feet separating the two center lines for simultaneous approaches. But if we got at least 2,500 feet, then they could do staggered approaches, but they have to have 1.5 miles separation between the two aircraft coming in. To be able to do parallel runway approaches. Now, one of the things that you can do is, you could do an approach for one runway, but maybe your place where you're going is on the other side of the airport, and so you could do a sidestep maneuver where you do approach for one runway with the intent of sidestepping over to the other runway. For that to happen, you can see that you got to have 2 parallel runways that are separated by no more than 1,200 feet between the two center lines. And the other approach must also have a straight in landing on the adjacent runway. It says you should execute the sidestep maneuver as soon as possible after you get the runway environment in sight. And if you're doing that, then it says it uses the non-precision approach criteria for the landing minimum. So you would not be able to do an ILS approach down to the 200-foot minimums. You'd have to do it to the next higher uh, non-precision minimums uh, for the runway. Doing the missed approach, so that allows the pilot to return back to the, you know, or the airspace structure while not whacking anything. Uh, the first thing you want to do when you decide to execute the missed approach is to enter into a climb. And that's actually one of the tasks that I find pilots do a fairly poor job at, because what they do is they add the full power, they pitch the plane up to the climb attitude they want, and then they get busy doing other stuff. And if you don't get the plane trimmed out properly for your climb attitude, then as soon as you start doing other things, your arm tends to relax and the plane starts to pitch down, and now you're either not climbing or, even worse, maybe even back into a descent. So, once your first job is to get yourself established in a climb. Uh, Aviate, navigate, turn to the appropriate heading, and then advise ATC that you're executing the missed approach. Keep in mind that, if the airport is under IFR conditions, the tower, depending on their capabilities, may not know that you're going missed approach. So you have to tell them, and then you'd want to request further clearance. Now, if you've been cleared for the approach, then at minimum you're cleared to the missed approach point and the holding pattern. If you need to execute the missed approach prior to getting to the missed approach point, uh, then you need to continue flying. You'd initiate a climb, but you continue navigating to the missed approach point before you conducted any further turns. You don't want to start turning early, because the missed approach procedures assume that you made it to the missed approach point before you started any turns. Now, there's other altitudes that you could use depending on your situation. If it was a loss of navigational equipment that caused you to have to go missed, there's different altitudes listed on the instrument approach procedure chart as a minimum safe altitude, that you want to at least get to that altitude before you conduct any further turns. And the other one would be, what we already went over there, if the visual reference is lost during a circle of land. So, pilots should immediately execute the missed approach when, one, told to do so by ATC. So, on a rare occasion, they may cancel your approach clearance and tell you to go missed. This happens, most often would be a scenario where they got a faster plane behind you, and maybe they didn't have the spacing they thought they had, so they need to get you out of the way. But you use your imagination, I guess, for any other reasons they might do it. Whenever the requirements are not met to operate below, so if we don't have any one of those three things, we have to go missed. If we don't have the airport environment in sight, we don't have our required flight visibility, or we're not in a position to make a normal landing, then we have to execute the missed. Or if during a circling maneuver we lose contact with the airport environment. Timed approaches from a holding fix. I would imagine, a fairly rare scenario that this might occur, especially nowadays. There's backups on backups, but typically, if a place like Rochester maybe lost if their radar went out of service, and they had to, talk people in on the instrument approaches, then that's when they would use timed approaches from a holding fix. So they would stack the airplanes up at different altitudes, and the one at the lowest would be the first one cleared for the approach. To do timed approaches from a fix, there has to be an operational control tower. You must have two-way radio communication with air traffic control. If there's more than one missed approach procedure, none of them can require a course reversal. Uh, and they have to have the highest ceiling and visibility minimums for the airport. So typically, when they're doing timed approaches, to be able to do the timed approaches, they would have to have typically your circling minimums at the airport. If there's only one missed approach procedure, the idea is they don't want you to have to go missed. If you are down at the lowest level and you've been cleared for the to depart a fix at an assigned time, you would want to modify your holding pattern as necessary to cross the fix as close as possible to the assigned time that you were told to leave it and execute the timed approach. Nowadays, I know, Rochester, if their radar goes out of service, they would just, pretty seamlessly pick up a digital feed off of Cleveland Center's radar. ADSB is adding to their capabilities as well, so I don't see too many scenarios that would cause us to have to do timed approaches from a fix, but those are the procedures there. So, uh, if the airport has a what we call an on-airport nav aid, or the facility is on the airport itself, then typically, there's not going to be uh, any timing required for the approach. Uh, the VOR itself is the missed approach point, so once you get turned around inbound, once you cross the VOR on the way inbound, then the approach is over. That is the missed approach point. To give yourself room to turn around and lose the necessary altitude, you want to make sure you're giving yourself at least 2 minutes on the outbound leg. Remain within any specified distance, which is typically 10 nautical miles. That'll be shown right on the instrument approach chart. May have step-down fixes based on distance measuring equipment, and this is one of the instances where, when they give you the clearance, one of the first things they tell you is your distance from, in this case, maybe the airport. But knowing that information is going to be important to make sure that you know you're at the right distance away to start any descents down to lower altitudes. The GPS overlay, again, when they were transitioning to a lot of GPS approaches, the easiest way to do that was to make a GPS overlay for approaches that were already in existence. A lot of those have been removed over the years in favor of just standard GPS approaches, with GPS, fast becoming the navigation standard. But if this had a GPS overlay, then it would include a final approach waypoint. So you could use that as a reference to do any of your outbound timing. So they would insert a final approach waypoint if there's a GPS overlay. For an off-airport approach, so this is the VOR Alpha approach into Leroy. You're typically going to need some kind of timing or distance measuring, one of those three things to know that you've reached the missed approach point. So doing this approach, outbound timing would be about a minute, as indicated by the type of hold here. If the Holding pattern lists a distance off of there instead of a time. You know, your GPS is going to take you, you know, if it's 4 miles, it's going to take you all the way out 4 miles away and start you turning back around. So just keep that in mind. Again, you want to remain within distance specified. And if it is a GPS overlay, then it's going to include a missed approach waypoint. So, nice thing about doing this with a GPS overlay is you would not have to do timing. If you didn't have distance measuring equipment or GPS, then you'd have to time how long you've been traveling from the final approach fix, and that's how you determine when it was time to do your missed approach. So that just adds one extra element to the things that we have to scan and keep track of on the approach. So having DME or GPS would make that approach go a lot easier. When can you cancel your IFR flight plan? Well, anytime you are in VFR conditions, you can cancel your IFR flight plan. You want to be careful about being too quick to do that. You know, you may cancel a little far out and encounter some weather conditions along the way. So you want to make sure that you have a pretty high expectation of being able to maintain VFR conditions for the rest of your flight before you go canceling an IFR flight plan. If you're going into a towered airport, you do not have to close your IFR flight plan. ATC will close your IFR flight plan for you upon landing. Non-towered airports, though, we have to either cancel with air traffic control in the air or on the ground. We have to call flight service up and tell them we're on the ground. You want to make sure you contact them as soon as possible. You know, once we land and we're pulling up to the gas pump or the hangar or whatever, we have a tendency to get very busy and preoccupied, and so that is a very often forgotten call. And I've been fortunate enough to make this mistake a few times over the years. One time, flight service called me on my phone, asked if I was on the ground, and I apologized and told them that I was, and they were very quick to tell me that that I need to make sure that I call them right away because there was another airplane holding at an initial approach fix, waiting for us to call before they could be cleared for the approach. So it's very important that you call and close your IFR flight plan as soon as possible to allow others to arrive or depart at the airport as necessary, because the non-towered airports, they only let one IFR operation happen at a time. So if somebody else has been cleared for an approach, then nobody else is going to be allowed to depart or do an instrument approach until you have canceled your IFR flight plan or are back in radio contact with air traffic control. So usually one of the last radio calls you'll get coming into a non-towered airport is they'll tell you radar service terminated, change advisory frequencies approved, report cancellation of IFR on this frequency or flight service on the ground. And then you can just acknowledge that. Usually I just give them a short frequency change approved and go on about my business. So they may, drop you from radar service, usually about 10 miles, away from the airport. So from there, you may be in the clouds still. So what we're counting on is, VFR pilots following the rules and making sure that they're not in there to, get the separation we need on the way in on the instrument approach, because there is no more radar service, nobody watching us anymore from that point on. We'll go over a few uncommon approaches that they have FAA test questions about. That's about it. One of them is a SDF, or Simplified Directional Facility. If you recall, your ILS uh, width was between 3 and 6 degrees as necessary to give you 700 feet full course deflection at the threshold. Uh, you have these simplified directional facilities, which are either set specifically at 3 or 12 degrees. May not be aligned with the runway. They usually, they do not have a glide slope associated with it. And a transmitter may be as much as 3 degrees offset of the center line. Big thing you need to know is right here, there's only 2 airports that still use them. I think one of them is in Tennessee. Which one is this? Yeah, this one here, Morristown, Tennessee. Still has an SDF approach. Another uncommon one is LDA, or localizer type directional aid. These are essentially the same as an ILS approach or localizer approach, except for they are offset from the center line of the runway. So you can see down here in the airport diagram, it shows what the final approach course looks like. So you're approaching that runway perpendicular to it on this LDA approach. This is at Van Nuys, California there. There's only 27 still in use, and 5 of those are in Alaska. I think they still have one that they use down in Washington, D.C. But again, they're not very common. They can have a glide slope. Because this one's more than 30 degrees offset, only circling minimums apply to it. This one does not look like it has a glide slope. It's just got a final approach fix. So there's no glide slope intercept altitude shown there. Down here. Another one is the GLS, or GPS landing system approach. So again, these are the new approaches on the market here. Using what they call a ground-based augmentation system, part of the next-gen system, not used for GA yet, but it allows curved and segmented approach paths to the runway. So they're using these to kind of more efficiently funnel aircraft into, typically your larger metropolitan areas. Dropping the home values of a lot of people that didn't used to have airplanes flying over top of them, I guess. With all that flexibility. The other thing that you can find is the charted visual approach. So this is the river visual runway 13 approach at LaGuardia. So to be able to do a charted visual approach, they must have an operating control tower. Ceilings must be at least 500 feet above the minimum vectoring or minimum IFR altitude, and you have to have at least 3 statute miles visibility. So tells you the procedure here. Once you've been cleared, you're going to remain over the Hudson River and still starting to turn to final north of Central Park. Expect 3,500 feet until a beam Central Park, 2,500 feet when authorized by ATC, and you can see some of the landmarks that you're going to be following up the Hudson there. You got the Statue of Liberty you're looking for, the Empire State Building, and Central Park. So that's kind of neat. Their radar is required, so if the radar is out of service, you will not be cleared for this charted visual approach. Ground control approach. Again, these are mostly military capabilities here. Some civilian airports, especially dual-use airports, may have ASR approach capabilities. But there's 2 kinds of ground control approaches. And what these are is, you don't have to have any navigational equipment on board the airplane. The ground controller, which is separate from the radar approach controller. These controllers are specifically tasked with guiding the aircraft into the airport. They have two versions of it. One is your ASR approach, which is your non-precision version, and that one you're going to get your azimuth and distance info, and then they're going to give you recommended altitudes up to the last mile down to the MDA, and they'll be giving you range info each mile up to the missed approach point. Then you have your PAR approach, which is the precision version. So not only are they able to give you lateral guidance, but they can also give you vertical guidance as well. And it says here they can get you down to 100 feet and a quarter mile. There's a separate radar associated with this approach. So you're talking to, again, that specific controller, that their only job is to guide you down to the runway. Again, you're typically only going to see a PAR approach at a military airport. Communications during a ground control approach. Every minute while being vectored, every 15 seconds while on a airport surveillance radar approach, every 5 seconds while on a precision approach radar final approach. And when you're you would make quick readbacks, repeating headings and altitudes until advised, and then at some point they'll say, do not acknowledge any further transmissions, because they're going to be talking at you pretty rapid fire, giving you those fine-tuned adjustments. Those airports can also give you a no gyro radar approach capability. So the idea here is if you lost your gyroscopic instruments, your vacuum system, and your flying partial panel, to help relieve your workload in the cockpit, you can request a no gyro radar approach, and they can guide you in. And then they're going to be giving you just simple instructions like turn left, stop, turn right, stop, turn, and any altitudes to descend to. Once you're on final approach, you just want to make those turns no more than half standard rate. So the visual approach is just a standard, not the same as the charted visual approach. This is just the actual visual approach. It can be issued by ATC. You're still on an IFR flight plan while conducting the visual approach, and it authorizes the pilot to proceed visually and clear of clouds to the airport. There is no missed approach point. If you're unable to complete the visual procedure, you would just handle it the same as you would handle a go-around. For them to be able to clear you for the visual approach, you must report either the airport or the preceding aircraft or the traffic you're following in sight. So this is why, when you're listening to radar, you'll often hear pilots, as soon as they can, they'll advise ATC that they have the airport in sight, so that they can get cleared for the visual approach. Because being cleared for the visual approach, just kind of shortcuts a lot of the time and distance that you have to fly, so they can get down on the ground a little faster. You got to have at least minimum VFR conditions, 1003, and all pilots are required to see and avoid, and can be initiated by ATC or the pilot, but you still have to have the clearance, if you request it as a pilot. The contact approach can only be requested by the pilot. This is kind of like the IFR version of like a special VFR approach. Now, the idea here is, let's say that you had an instrument approach, that started over here, a GPS approach, And then this is the airport. That's your final approach fix. And if you're flying on your way over there and you have contact with the ground, and at least a mile visibility, you can request a contact approach where you can navigate via ground reference to the airport. And how that's going to shortcut you is, that's typically, 10 miles to that point, another 5 miles there, and another 10 miles back. So it could save you, up to about, you know, 25 miles worth of flying by doing a contact approach. Uh, they must have a functioning published instrument approach at the airport that the aircraft has the capability of doing. So, like our airport has GPS approaches, so unless you have a functional IFR certified GPS on board the airplane, you cannot do the contact approach. So the idea is not to, uh, shortcut your ability to do the actual approach. You must be able to do whatever approach is at the airport. Once you've been cleared for the contact approach, you don't have to see the airport specifically, but you have to be able to see landmarks on the ground that allow you to navigate to the airport. You have to maintain the required flight visibility, 1 mile. You got to stay clear of clouds. Terrain obstruction clearance is on you, and must be able to maintain that ground separation. Now, again, once you've been granted a contact approach, you're still on an IFR flight plan. So if at any time during the contact approach you lose, visibility or ceilings get too low or whatever the case is, you just enter into a climb, advise air traffic control, and they would get you turned back around and instructions necessary to go do the actual instrument approach. Thing to keep in mind is ATC provides IFR separation and IFR special VFR separation. So if there's any VFR traffic flying around, it's your responsibility to see and avoid that traffic. Stop. I don't think I've ever seen a reason to use a contact approach, but I have done it with students as a, as an example, but usually it's just easier to just do the approach. The But doing a contact approach is a good reason to make sure that you do have, some VFR charts available on the airplane so that you can get the minimum, VFR and obstacle clearance altitudes wherever you may be flying. GPS approaches, the basic design is what we call the basic T, where most of these segments are, 5 miles, roughly 5 miles apart. The standard is 5 miles. See, sometimes they're a little bit longer. See, if there's a GPS overlay approach of an existing non-precision approach, the ground facility must be operational, but you do not have to monitor it. You cannot, if you have, a WAS GPS, WAS capable IFR certified GPS is authorized for en route and terminal navigation, meaning that you can use it exclusively to go from point A to point B. If all you have on board is a non-WAS certified GPS, then you must also have some kind of ground-based navigation equipment available. So you'd have to have an operational VOR or something like that to go along with it. The GPS must be certified for IFR flight, and there should be a placard on the instrument panel saying so, what it's certified and capable of doing. Has to have RAIM capability, which is where it's autonomously monitoring the integrity of the receiver. To do an approach, we have to have 5 satellites in view. So that can be predicted by the RAIM, and there's usually a page on there in the GPS that after you input your flight plan, you can get a RAIM prediction as to whether you're going to have those 5 satellites in view at the arrival time. The big thing is if you're doing an instrument approach, if the GPS never cycles to one of its approach modes, LNAV, VNAV, LPV, then you cannot descend any lower past the final approach fix. You'd have to stay at or above, in this case, 2,100 feet, fly the mist to the approach point, and execute the published mist. So if you're still in the terminal mode upon arrival at the final approach fix, you cannot descend past that point. Let's see, we talked about the fly-by waypoints and the fly-over waypoints. Remember, your missed approach point is always going to be a fly-over waypoint. These are fly-by, so your GPS typically is going to give you turn anticipation so that you kind of round the corner there and fly right on to the next course line. This is what your sensitivity looks like. Typically for the en route for a non-WAS GPS, it's going to be plus or minus 5 nautical miles, which means that relative to the center, each dot is going to be worth 1 nautical mile. If it's a WAS GPS, then it's going to, full scale deflection is going to be 2 nautical miles. Once you get close enough, within 30 miles or within 1 minute of hitting this point here, it starts to, sensitivity starts to ramp down to the terminal mode. And once you're in the terminal mode, then it's plus or minus 1 nautical mile. And on the LNAV approach, beyond the final approach fix, and it starts that ramp down 2 miles prior to the final approach fix, but from there, it's 0.3 nautical miles full scale deflection. And the LPV approach starts to increase in sensitivity, but it maintains a constant from the point that it gets plus or minus at 350 feet. It maintains a constant course width from there, which is kind of nice because the ILS, a typical ILS approach still gets, like a VOR, infinitely sensitive as you get close to the missed approach point there. And, your GPS is not susceptible to, generally not susceptible to any radio interference, so you get a much more steady signal of your needles on your indicator, where the ILS sometimes tends to, they can bend a little bit or do some funny things sometimes. I usually find, when you get about 300 feet left to go, the glide slope starts to do a little funny thing there sometimes. So you gotta watch out for that. Ooh, ooh. Okay, so looking at the LNAV approach. So LNAV stands for your lateral navigation. This is a non-precision instrument approach for non-WAS equipped GPSs. Again, you're going to get that lateral navigation of plus or minus 0.3 nautical miles beyond the final approach fix. And you're typically going to have higher minimums. You can see this approach here has, we got our minimum descent altitude is 1,000 feet. We got to have 1 mile visibility. And so the ceiling has to be, higher than 600 feet to be able to do that approach. When you look at these instrument approaches, you typically read from the top down. So up here we got the heading section. It's called the plan view section. We got the profile view, and then you have your, I'm sorry. Ding, ding. You got the profile view, the minimum section, and your airport diagram, or all the different things that you're going to review kind of from in a top-down way there. When you have a non-precision approach, you usually want to make a descent that's going to allow you to get close to your MDA, usually at least about 2 to 3 miles from the final approach fix. So that gives you time to scan for the airport. You can see this approach here has LNAV, VNAV, so that's lateral navigation with vertical guidance for WAS-equipped aircraft. You can see it lists a decision altitude. And we're going to have a glide slope down to that altitude. Usually a little higher minimums, though, than a regular LPV approach. So the LNAV approach is still going to give you that plus or minus 0.3 nautical mile deflection. So it's not as precise as like an LPV approach. And so it's going to have slightly higher approach minimums. But you do get vertical guidance, you get a glide slope. Now, even following the glide slope, you would have to stay at or above, well, no, that is your decision altitude. So you'd have to see the airport at that point, at that altitude, and have at least 2 miles visibility for you to be able to do that approach. So you got your decision altitude, and you got your 2 miles there for the LNAV, VNAV. Your LPV approach, again, this is like your IFR version of an ILS approach. You have a glide slope intercept altitude that's listed with the little lightning bolt symbol down here. And you'll notice that it's got a line down underneath it. The line underneath means that that's a at or above altitude, but you don't want to, usually we try to get down to that 2,000 feet, but technically there's nothing wrong with staying at, we'd have to be higher than 3,100 prior to crossing Walco intersection, but once we were inbound there, a lot of pilots will stay at this altitude, catch the glide slope, and start following it down from there. But not the case. Once you hit Walco, you can descend down to 2,000 feet, and you have to stay at or above 2,000 until you do catch the glide slope. Once you do that, that's going to take you down to the decision altitude, which in this case would be 706. You got to have a mile visibility, and that's going to get you down to 284 feet above the ground. They can get you lower. They can get you as low as about 200 feet. LP approach. This is it's a GPS approach, but it's kind of like a localizer approach without a So no glide slope. There's no glide slope intercept altitude. You just get a final approach fix. Uh, get an altitude to descend down to, a minimum descent altitude of, in this case, 1020, and you got to have a mile visibility, which is going to get you 473 feet above the ground. So you'd have to have, at least a 600-foot ceiling would be better to give yourself a good chance to be able to get in there. Before wide use of the WAS GPS to provide some kind of glide slope, you had these BaroNav or Baro VNav GPS approaches. It calculated a glide slope for you. One of the things it is integrated with the static pressure input. And so as part of setting up for the approach, one of the things that you had to do was put in the altimeter setting to get an accurate glide slope down there. But not too commonly used anymore. The LNAV plus V, so if you have a WAS-capable GPS, even if you're doing an LNAV approach, it will give you what we call an advisory glide slope. So it's going to calculate a glide slope for you. You can see down here, it came up with a glide slope for you. Now, keep in mind that even though you have a glide slope, that's still a non-precision approach. So once you get down to the minimum descent altitude, you got to stay at or above that altitude until you have the three things necessary to descend below it. But most often, you get down there to your minimum descent altitude. If you're on glide slope, typically you're going to see the airport. But in either case, you got to stay at or above there until you get to the missed approach point. Just want to go over just a couple approaches so you can start. I want to start working on briefing approaches. Let's grab a easier one here. So whenever you brief an approach, where'd my mouse go? There it goes. Bing. But whenever you brief an approach, you usually start from the top down, and you start in the upper left-hand corner here, which is going to tell you about the primary nav aid that's going to be used for that approach. So in this case, it's referencing the Geneseo VOR, and it gives you the frequency and the DME channel if you're using that. It gives you what the final approach course is. That's just kind of giving you a heads up as to so you know what the approach is going to try to do. That's your goal, is to get on the 323 degree inbound course. And it gives you a little bit of landing zone information. Now, because this is you'll notice that this approach does not reference a specific runway. It's just got an A there. So that implies then that there are no straight-in approach minimums for this airport. For this approach, it's just taking you to the airport environment. Now, if there's more than one VOR approach that was also not specifically to the runway, then you might have the VOR Bravo. For some reason, and I'm sure they have some naming convention, but sometimes they'll start at the end of the alphabet, you'll see a VOR Zulu, VOR Yankee. But anyway, if it's not specifically to a specific runway, then it's just going to have a letter code there. So that's why it's not giving you the runway landing zone elevation or touchdown zone elevation or runway landing distance touchdown zone elevation. It only gives you the airport elevation. Up here, this is telling you the T, that there's non-standard takeoff departure minimums. And here is telling you that there's non-standard alternate approach minimums. In fact, it says it is not authorized, so we cannot use this approach or this airport as an alternate airport using this approach. It gives us some notes for the airport that you want to read through. So this one tells us to use the Greater Rochester altimeter setting. Circling runway 10 is not authorized at night. When circling to runway 28 at night, operational visual glide slope indicator is required, and you want to remain at or above the visual glide slope glide path until you get to the threshold. So if their PAPI lights were out of service, then you would not be able to do a circling approach to runway 28 at night. And if you're doing this approach at night, the only runway that you could circle to would be 28. You could not use runway 10 at night. Then it gives you the textual description of the missed approach procedure. So it tells us if we don't get the airport in sight, we're going to do a climbing left turn to 4,000 feet direct to the VOR and then hold. Next we have the frequencies section. They're usually listed in the order that you can expect to use the frequencies. So it's given us the Rochester, well, that's the 8 is, but why? Because we need the Rochester altimeter setting. So we need to listen to that to get the altimeter setting. If we're inbound, we're probably already talking to air traffic control, but if you didn't know what frequency you need to be on, maybe you had to restart your radio or something, there's a frequency there, and the frequency for the airport. We got the common traffic advisory frequency because it's non-towered. Then we look at the plan view here to get an idea about how we're going to get established on the final approach course. So we can see that they're using a holding pattern course reversal, which means that if we were coming from this direction here, we would plan on doing a parallel entry to get established inbound. And then once we cross that, we can continue straight inbound on the 323. We got a cross radial here off of the Rochester VOR, the R227 radial. It does get some altitudes here, so it tells us, we could descend down on this leg. We can go down to 2,600 feet on the 323 radial, and the distance to units intersection is 7.6 miles. Then it's giving us the DME distance to the missed approach point. So if we had DME, we could use that off of the Geneseo VOR. If we're using a GPS, we could overlay. We can use Madgley intersection as our missed approach point. And then we got the dash lines that kind of show us what our missed approach path is going to be. So this is giving us a climbing left turn here as it shows us there. Back to the VOR. And, we would enter back into the holding pattern there. Some altitudes here. We have our minimum safe altitudes here. So if we're coming from this area up here, then the minimum altitude, minimum safe altitude would be 2,800 feet. Anywhere else would be 3,600. So where we might use that is if we, something went wrong on the approach, and especially if we lost any navigational signals or radio contact or whatever, we'd want to immediately begin a climb up to, an altitude that's at or above those minimum safe altitudes to make sure that we're not going to whack anything. You always want to make sure you read any notes And once we're done with the plan view, then we scroll down to the profile view. So on the profile view, it's telling us that during our uh, oh, once we cross this fix, if we're at some higher altitude, then while we're going outbound, you can immediately begin to descent down to 4,000 feet after you cross that fix. Anytime during the maneuver, sometimes the approach plate will specify that you can't begin down to that altitude until you're established back inbound. But unless it says that specifically, then once you cross the fix, you can immediately begin a descent down to 4,000 feet. We want to stay in altitude at or above 4,000 feet as we got turn around. Excuse me, turn around back inbound. And then once we cross that fix, we can go down to 2,600. The little cross here represents the final approach fix. And once we cross that point, units intersection, or the Geneseo 7.6 DME, we can go down to the missed approach point, which is referenced by those two things there. Now, if you don't have GPS or DME capability, then you'd have to use timing. And so we would go down to, once we pass 2,600, once we pass units intersection, we begin descent down to an altitude at or above that, 1,440 feet. We're going to have at least a mile visibility, and you can see the ceiling is going to be need to be at least about 700 feet. If we had to do timing, we got this little section here that tells us about the timing necessary for doing 90 knots. For a distance of 4.7 miles, it's going to take us 3 minutes and 8 seconds. Technically, if you know your ground speed to be different, you can do some time speed distance calculations to make your own timing. But usually we're doing our approaches at about 90 knots. And if you didn't do that calculation, you'd want to use, roughly 3 minutes and 8 seconds. But it is based on just time, speed, and distance calculation based on your ground speed for 4.7 miles, however long that's going to take you. So the airport diagram is important because it shows you what your final approach course is going to look like as you arrive at the airport. So depending on when you see the airport, you could, if you're landing runway 28, if you saw it early enough, you can sidestep over and do a base and final. If you saw it a little late, you can, try to stick to left-hand patterns when possible, and just enter a traffic pattern like that, circle around. But you'd have to stay within that 1.3 nautical miles. Until you had the landing point in sight. Or I'm sorry, we're in a position, those three things, in a position to make a normal landing, airport in sight with the minimum visibility. So again, just kind of a top-down run through your approach plate whenever you want to brief it. If we look at GPS approach, we see what our final approach course is. So the final approach course 280. We got the runway landing distance 3,803 feet. Touchdown zone elevation 422 and the airport elevation of 424. We got a lot of notes that you want to run through. The textual description of your missed approach procedures, so that would just be a climb to 3,000 feet direct to Goyer intersection and hold. You got the radio frequencies, and then down here you'd want to pick the initial approach fix that you want to use. So if you're, coming from anywhere out here, you probably just use the Jorax initial fix. If I was coming anywhere from over here on this half, I'd probably use Walco, because if you're using Walco intersection here, you can see that you don't have to do a procedure turn, so you would just cross the fix and go. If you were using Walco from anywhere on this side, on the west side here, then you would have to use the holding pattern entry to get established inbound. Now, depending on when you were cleared for the approach, let's say that you were arriving at the airport and you were still at 5,000 feet when you were cleared for the approach. On GPS approaches, you have what we call a TAA, or a terminal arrival area. And once you get into the TAA, if you've been cleared for the approach, you can begin some automatic step down. So once you're within 30 nautical miles of Jorax intersection, you can start down to 3,400. Once you're within 20 miles, you can start down to 3,100. And then from there, you're just going to cross Jorax intersection, stay at or above 3,100, turn and descend down to altitude at or above 2,000 to the final approach fix here, which is going to take you to the missed approach waypoint, and then you can see the hold as you heading out to Goyer intersection and getting into the hold out there. Once you have that, then you want to go down to the profile view. So if we were using Walco or wherever, we'd want to stay at or above 3,100 till we're established inbound on 281. The GPS is going to cycle. It does what we call 2-2 navigation, meaning every time you cross a waypoint, it automatically cycles to the next waypoint. So you will see, the GPS is going to be telling you, that you're approaching your waypoint, and usually give you turn instructions for turn anticipation based on your speed and how many degrees you have to turn and doing standard rate turns. And as you cross the fix, you'll actually see the CDI needle flip to a from, and you'll see it flip right away back to a 2 as it cycles to the next fix. The active leg that you're on is usually the one that's in magenta, so you'll also see that new leg highlighted to tell you what leg of the approach that you're on, and it will list what initial or what fix you're navigating to. If you're doing a LPV approach or a precision type approach where you're using a glide slope, then your glide slope intercept altitude is 2,000 feet. So you want to stay there, catch the glide slope. So you would catch the glide slope right at this point and start down. If you're doing a non-precision approach, then that little cross there represents the final approach fix. And from there you would start a descent down to an altitude at or above your MDA and continue on from there. Usually it gives you, another thing you want to look for if there's a glide slope is what the glide path angle is. So the standard is 3 degrees. You can see this one's 3.2, which means that we need a slightly higher descent rate to fly this approach. TCH is our threshold crossing height, so if you are on the glide path as you come across the threshold, you're going to be 43 feet above the runway. You can see all the distances are listed for each route segment. Once you're executing the approach and you've been asked to change to radar service terminated, change the advisory frequencies approved, then the minimum calls that they like us to do is 10 miles out, and then you start calling final approach at about 3 miles, and then make another final approach call at 1 mile. You can certainly add to those radio calls depending on the traffic. You want to give way to any aircraft that may be ahead of you. Worst case, you would just sidestep and enter the pattern as appropriate to come in and land that way. If you're going to be doing that, though, you'd have to be at or above your circling altitude. But this shows how you're going to be approaching the runway, so pretty much straight on there. So anyway, just a brief introduction. We're going to be going through more instrument approach procedures next time, focusing on, reading and interpreting the data on the instrument approach procedures, to include a lot of the instrument approach procedures that are used in the figures guide for the knowledge test. But, I give on the checklist I gave you, it has an approach briefing to kind of, that follows essentially that top-down format. But you should start looking at different instrument approach procedures. That way, if you come up with any questions or see anything weird, we can bring it up for discussion next time. But other than that, I think that's enough information for tonight. Just start looking at instrument approach charts for different airports. Look at airports that you might fly to, see what instrument approaches they have, and see if you can brief them and talk them out how you would plan on doing that approach. If you guys have any questions, now would be the time to fire them up, type them in there. All right. All right, guys. I think that's going to be it. I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. If you guys come up with any questions, again, you can email them to me, and we'll make sure we go over that next time. That's all I've got for tonight. So stay healthy and enjoy your working at home time, and we'll see you soon. So thanks a lot, guys. Have a good night.